Rome, the city that called itself eternal, seemed invincible. Its armies dominated from the burning deserts of Africa to the icy north of Britain. Its temples shone as proof of its glory, and its emperors felt almost like gods. But what the world saw as stability was, in reality, an illusion. In the innermost halls of the imperial palace, it wasn't the barbarians or enemy armies that threatened Rome's future. It was something far more sinister, the relentless hatred between two brothers, Caracalla and Geta, sons of Septimius Severus, heirs to the most powerful throne on earth. Two young men destined to rule together, yet cursed by a poison that ran in their veins from childhood: envy, ambition, and resentment. Their father, believing that with both of them he would secure peace, made the mistake that would forever change the empire's fate. He divided power between them. And that gesture, which seemed prudent, became the beginning of a tragedy. Because absolute power is never shared. And even less so between two men who despised each other with an intensity capable of setting everything ablaze. This is the story of how blood, instead of uniting, became the chain that dragged them toward destruction. A story that official chroniclers tried to soften, but which the closest sources reveal as one of the most disturbing episodes in Rome. The silent war between two brothers willing to do anything, even destroy themselves in order to rule alone. Stay with us, because what you are about to discover is not just any story. It is proof that even the greatest empires can fall, not at the hands of foreigners, but because of the hatred that dwells within their own walls. And if you want to keep uncovering these hidden truths of history, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because what's coming will leave you breathless. Septimius Severus, a feared and respected emperor, had built his power with blood and fire. With an iron hand, he crushed rebellions, faced civil wars, and made it clear that in Rome, authority survived only when absolute. But behind that facade of greatness, Severus knew his legacy was at risk. He had two sons, and neither was willing to live in the shadow of the other. Instead of choosing one and securing succession, he made a fatal mistake, appointing both as co-emperors. What he thought would be balance was, in reality, a sentence. Because Caracalla and Geta were not allies, they were sworn rivals. The soldiers, who admired Caracalla's brutality and strength, saw him as the natural heir. Senators and the people, however, found in Geta a more refined, just, and ideal ruler. Rome was divided even before Severus died. And when the emperor finally closed his eyes forever, he left not peace, but a bomb about to explode. Two young men with the same power, the same right, the same throne. Two brothers who would never accept sharing the world. A father's mistake became an empire's curse. Caracalla and Geta had grown up under the same roof, sharing the same blood and lineage, yet they were opposites in every way. And that difference was the fuel that ignited an impossible hatred. Caracalla was fire, violent, impulsive, brutal. From a young age, he delighted in showing strength and inspiring fear. Soldiers admired him because they saw in him a ruthless warrior, a man capable of crushing anyone in his path. His mere gaze was enough to freeze blood. Geta, on the other hand, was air, calculating, serene, refined. Smaller and less physically imposing, but with sharp intelligence and a voice that captivated those who listened. Senators respected him, the people loved him, and even his enemies saw him as a more civilized ruler than his older brother. But what might have been balance in another context became a deadly cage at the heart of the palace. Caracalla despised Geta's popularity, seeing it as a threat to his supremacy. Geta, in turn, feared his brother's unpredictable and cruel temper, knowing that living under his shadow was a sentence. There was no room for two such different natures on the same throne. One represented uncontrolled force, the other diplomacy, still believing in law and tradition. And both knew the empire could not serve two masters. All of Rome became a divided chessboard. The Praetorian Guard monitored every gesture, senators whispered in dark corridors, and even the gods seemed to watch as the fraternal rivalry threatened to drag the empire to ruin. The imperial palace, meant to symbolize unity and greatness, transformed into a silent battlefield. Marble walls no longer witnessed glorious banquets, but hateful stares and poisoned conversations. Caracalla and Geta could barely be in the same room without the guards tensing, ready to intervene. Their enmity was so obvious that servants walked on eggshells, careful with every word, fearing that a simple gesture of sympathy toward one brother would be seen as betrayal by the other. All of Rome was trapped in this cold war. Soldiers leaned toward Caracalla, the Iron Emperor, promising glory and rewards. Senators, on the other hand, secretly met with Geta, betting on a more civilized ruler. The empire was not divided by borders, it was split in two within its own walls. The palace corridors were filled with spies and traitors. Advisors feared speaking too much, friends turned into enemies, and even noble families had to swear loyalty twice, once in public and once in private. No one was safe. The tension was so unbearable that even the gods seemed silent, as if sensing that Rome's fate would not be decided on a battlefield, but in a fratricide that would forever stain the heart of the empire. Caracalla understood very early that killing his brother was not enough. Death alone could turn Geta into a martyr. And that was the last thing he wanted. He sought something far crueler, to strip him of everything, to deprive him of allies, power, and even dignity, reducing him to a ghost without voice or memory. The first step was isolation. Senators close to Geta began receiving veiled warnings. Some were sent into exile, others simply disappeared overnight. Military officers loyal to the younger brother were transferred to distant lands, far from Rome, where their influence could pose no threat. Geta's inner circle was infiltrated with traitors bought with gold or threatened with the sword. Every conversation, every gesture, every decision reached Caracalla's ears. Rome became a labyrinth of spies, and Geta began to notice that the smiles around him were no longer sincere. The second step was to erase his image. Caracalla began spreading rumors that Geta was conspiring against him, that he was weak, that he was unfit to rule. The same men who had publicly praised him days earlier now remained silent or repeated the words dictated by his older brother. And while the shadow of betrayal spread, Caracalla secretly nurtured an even darker idea. He didn't want Geta to disappear quickly, he wanted to see him break slowly. To make him an example of what happens to anyone who dared challenge absolute power. Step by step, the older emperor built an invisible trap. Geta still breathed, but he was already dead in the heart of Rome. When hatred had already poisoned every corner of the palace, Caracalla played his most perverse card, the mask of reconciliation. He sent his brother a solemn invitation, disguised as a fraternal gesture. He proposed a private meeting to put differences aside and, at least in the eyes of Rome, display the unity their father had wished for. Geta, exhausted by tension and solitude, hesitated. He knew his brother was unpredictable, cruel, capable of anything. But he also knew that if he refused the invitation, everyone would see him as the cause of the division. And in that dilemma he made the worst decision of his life. He accepted. The chosen night was heavy with symbolism. The palace lit by torches, the silent corridors, and a thick air that seemed to foretell misfortune. Geta arrived with a handful of guards, but what he didn't know was that each of them had already been bought by Caracalla. Inside, his brother greeted him with a cold smile, the kind that conveys not peace but anticipated triumph. The atmosphere seemed cordial, soft words, family memories, promises of unity, but beneath every phrase beat a lie. Geta didn't know it, but he had not come to a reconciliation. He had walked into a carefully designed trap. In that room, among shadows and silence, the fate of the empire would be sealed. What was about to happen was not a brotherly agreement, it was the prelude to a betrayal that would leave an indelible stain on Rome's history. The crime had already been consummated. Geta, the inconvenient brother, had fallen into the trap. But for Caracalla, it was not enough to eliminate him in private. True victory lay in erasing his existence from Rome's memory. He ordered what the Romans called damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Geta's statues were destroyed, his portraits ripped from the walls, his name scratched from official inscriptions as if he had never existed. Where an inscription once read, Emperors Caracalla and Geta, the stone was mutilated until only one name remained. The people, forced to obey, watched as Geta's images were reduced to dust in public ceremonies. Senators who had once cheered for him had to remain silent. Soldiers who had respected him pretended not to remember. All of Rome was compelled to participate in this theater of silence, where fear dictated truth. The most terrifying thing was not the young emperor's death, but the obedience of those around him. Caracalla had not only killed his brother, he had killed his memory. And when an empire accepts erasing the truth out of fear, the crime is no longer one person's alone, it becomes everyone's guilt. With Geta erased from history, Caracalla finally found himself alone on the throne. But the victory did not calm him, on the contrary, it unleashed the worst in his soul. The brother who had shared his blood no longer existed, and with him went the last barrier containing his fury. He ruled with sickening cruelty. Senators lived in terror. Any gesture could be interpreted as betrayal and cost them their lives. Soldiers, who had initially supported him, soon discovered that his generosity was based on fear, not loyalty. Caracalla gave gold and privileges, but at the slightest sign of doubt, the sword fell without mercy. In the streets of Rome, the people whispered in secret. Everyone knew what he had done to Geta, but no one dared speak his name. The entire city became a stage of enforced silence, where truth was forbidden and lies were mandatory. Meanwhile, the emperor sank into excesses. He claimed to be a living god, organized grotesque rituals, and each day seemed more obsessed with proving that nothing and no one could challenge him. But what appeared to be absolute power was actually the beginning of his downfall. Because an empire ruled by fear is doomed to fracture from within. With only one brother on the throne, Rome gained not stability, but darkness. The entire empire was trapped under the shadow of Caracalla, a ruler who answered to no one but his own demons. His reign was marked by massacres and bloody whims. Entire cities were punished for minor suspicions, whole legions were sacrificed in campaigns that sought not glory, but to feed his ego and suppress the ghosts that haunted him. Ordinary people lived between silence and fear. No one dared to speak of Geta aloud, but in whispers, in dark taverns and bustling markets, stories were told of the young emperor erased from official memory. Rome was a divided empire. The truth of the book said one thing, the truth of the people said another. The closest advisors knew that Caracalla was not a leader, but a ticking time bomb. His decisions were erratic, his temperament unpredictable, and each day he seemed more consumed by paranoia. The very men who had supported him began to realize that if Rome were to survive, sooner or later it would have to rid itself of him. The empire, once shining with glory, now teetered on the edge of the abyss. Not because of foreign invasions, not because of external enemies, but because its ruler was the greatest enemy of his own people. Caracalla believed that by eliminating his brother, he had secured his power. But all he achieved was to dig his own grave. His reign, marked by blood and paranoia, ended as all reigns of terror begin, with betrayal. The same circle that had helped him plan Geta's death began conspiring against him. His allies grew tired of an emperor who saw enemies everywhere and turned Rome's glory into a pit of fear. In the end, it was not a foreign army that brought him down, nor a powerful rival, but a dagger driven by those who had once been his trusted men. His death did not erase the pain nor restore lost dignity, but it left a lesson written in the darkest pages of history. Absolute power does not create gods, it creates monsters. The tragedy of Caracalla and Geta is more than a bloody episode of the past. It is an eternal warning. It reminds us that even the strongest empires can fall when those who rule confuse the crown with divine right and turn blood into a weapon. Rome survived Caracalla, but it never was the same again. And its story, marked by fraternal hatred and boundless cruelty, continues to speak to us today with brutal clarity. The most dangerous enemy of a nation is not always outside. Sometimes it sleeps under the same roof. If this story moved you and you want to discover more hidden truths of history, subscribe and turn on notifications. What's coming will show you that in the past, reality was always darker than we imagined.